welcome to Bold Leaders in Learning. Dan Stratford pinch hitting for Brandon Busteed today. Brandon taking care of some stuff on the home front, so wish him well, and he'll be back next week hosting Bold Leaders in Learning. Happy to be here, though, to talk to Tom Davidson, of course, the founder of EVERFI. And Tom, it's a pleasure to talk to you here today, but people are here to hear from you, not hear from me. So why don't, if you could, give us your background first, and then sort of give us the background on EVERFI and what brings to this conversation around Bold Leaders in Learning.
In the great state of Maine, and went out and knocked on something like 38,000 doors over the course of many months, and got elected to the state legislature. And that began an incredible 6-year journey for me, where I spent a lot of time focused on education technology very early in the game. The very first wiring of schools and libraries. Maine was incredibly aggressive about one-to-one laptop initiatives and getting access to kids. A lot of the issues we're still struggling with now, from broadband access to technology and beyond. And that really ignited just a real passion and love for what I had hoped, and what I still believe very much, where technology can be a very impactful and meaningful part of the puzzle for a kid's education. And also beyond that, could really change the game and put institutions that really mattered in the business of solving really seemingly intractable social issues. And so I came up with the idea for EVERFI with a couple of very good friends of mine from college, and started it, now about 13 years ago, in the back of an RV, driving across the Mississippi Delta and Alabama Black Belt and Native American reservations across the country to get it going.
That is a great origin story, and sounds like it could be a movie at some point in the not too distant future. But you're tackling a lot, right? There are a lot of things you just talked about in your origin story and what your focus is. How does EVERFI do this work? What is it that EVERFI does on a daily basis, and how would you describe how you get into all these different lanes?
Sure. So there's a unique model to EVERFI that really was very unique, and not many people have been able to pull it off since, if anyone. Our idea really was, there was something that I knew coming into this, which was I never, ever wanted to go to a local school district and ask them to buy something from us. Number one, the cycles on that are forever. And number two, these were areas that we wanted to focus on that were very much outside of the core. So what EVERFI, just to give you a little background on what we do, EVERFI picks these issues that have a huge impact on the lives of people and communities. So if you think about financial wellness and financial capability, financial literacy, think about, why don't we train people to understand how mortgages work, how debt compounds itself, how you tear down your credit score, how you build it back up. It was always crazy to me that we never learned that in school. And when I got out of college, I learned this the way we all learn it, was through pain. I destroyed my credit. I missed payments. I missed bills. And it wasn't until years into the game that I understood, how that all worked. So number one, we looked out and said, what are issues like that are not taught in schools, but that have a huge impact one way or the other on changing the trajectory of people's lives? So we started in financial literacy. We moved into sexual assault prevention on college campuses, alcohol responsibility, in partnership actually with Brandon Busteed. Right. And his first company that he started outside the classroom, which is a brilliant trailblazer in the education space that we were lucky enough to acquire and then build into the fabric of EVERFI. And Brandon's just a genius for coming up with that idea. And then we moved into healthcare literacy. It's fascinating how little we understand about the navigation of the health system. And so these are areas, mental health for students, bullying, digital wellness. So these are not, you'll never see EVERFI build out an online course in chemistry or biology or math. There's lots of people that do that really well. We've picked these areas that are really often left off of the grid and left outside of the school day. And the model's been fascinating. We, instead of taking that and selling that to school districts, we actually team with the world's leading foundations, private sector foundations, world's largest institutions and companies who license that software for communities that they care about. So our customers are actually an incredible group of people and companies like Mass Mutual Foundation, the NFL's foundation, you think about JP Morgan and Truist and some of the HCA and Kaiser and some of the really wonderful institutions in the country who are licensing this, in particular for students in high poverty areas.
One of the things I noticed on your website while reading up was at the bottom, the EVERFI is free, 4 capital letters, for educators. As a business model, how important was it for you to make that the focus here, to put into educators' hands, districts' hands, these tools at no cost to them?
Yeah, it really was the cornerstone of the idea, and it was the cornerstone of our model, and continues to this day. And there were 2 things that I felt were really important coming into this. Number one is, the challenge with ed tech, and what I was always worried about with education technology, is I didn't want it to become one more thing that districts that had the means and the resources could get the best stuff. And if you were in a low tax base area, or an area that was that didn't have the sidecar resources, the private foundation that runs the booster network that is able to bring this stuff, you were out of luck. And so that was the main reason why we wanted to build out this model this way. And I think I'm really glad that we did that. And because number one, these are areas we have a chance that we're in the first inning of ed tech right now. We really are. And you have the chance to set the guardrails on whether this is going to be just something that, frankly, rich school districts can afford and others can't. Public sector, you can't rely on the public sector to fund this stuff. And I always say that people always say, well, don't you worry about the private sector being, moving on to something else, getting finicky, deciding to do it one year. And I'm like, have you ever met a state government before? Have you ever watched what happens when you move from Democratic governor to Republican governor to Democratic governor? If you don't believe there's a difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration on their philosophies around the Department of Education, the stuff really plays out at the local level, and it can whipsaw, and you're left with school districts saying, I don't know what's going to get funded. And I don't know. And that was stuff I just really understood from, being in the mix of having to vote on these things and fund these things from the state level. It was important to build the model that way.
I am here with Tom Davidson, CEO and founder of EVERFI, sitting in for Brandon Busteed. You see the lower third says Brandon. Brandon had to go take care of something, but still want to have a very important conversation here with Tom. Now, I think a lot of people out there are aware of what software as a service is, right? The idea of a company that has software and provides it as a service. But you've talked more and more about impact as a service. Can you dive into that a little bit more for us and maybe lay out what that means and how that leads you to some decisions with EVERFI?
Yeah, it's a huge idea. I think, listen, it's kind of catchy to use software is eating the world, and everyone knows how impactful technology is on every part of our lives. If you look across really at any space, and ride sharing, e-commerce, Salesforce management, data, there are companies that define those spaces. There's always leaders that come in and develop really a software answer, a technology answer to help make life easier and to help companies and others do what they need to do in those spaces. We don't think impact is any different. That companies are entering, some of them being dragged, but certainly all of them are facing this new era of ESG and kind of corporate social responsibility and impact. And we think that there's going to be a huge role that software and technology plays in allowing businesses to get in that game, to report on that game and communicate that out to their employees, their customers, their stakeholders, and others. And that software is going to drive that. And there are big foundational elements of this idea of impact as a service. The first is area where we sit, where there's this like missing learning layer that is happening both inside of the enterprise and outside of the enterprise. On the inside, it's, are you measuring and training and auditing around pay equity and gender pay equity and racial pay equity? Are you, addressing unconscious bias? Are you dealing with things like harassment and training up your managers to deal with a culture where people can arrive at the workplace every day, if we ever come back to the workplace, feeling like their whole selves? And that's a really big internal cultural piece that we have to build, that learning layer. Externally, there are things that are missing from local schools, community-based organizations, and others that for years, companies have stepped into the void of. Banks providing financial education to schools, organizations providing things like bullying or food security programs or other things. That can be helped and elevated and scaled using technology. As you go around the wheel on the impact as a service thing, you move from the learning layer to areas like you see with Guild and Flatiron and others who are in Stride that are providing education as a benefit to employees. It's really powerful stuff. There are companies that are being built, really big companies that are scaling, that are growing super fast, putting businesses in the business of providing education to their workers to upskill them and produce the next generation jobs that are going to be needed down the road. The next piece is obviously around climate. Everything from plastics remediation to a carbon zero, push that companies are making. Technology is going to allow people to report on that. Institutional shareholders, investors, others are demanding it. You're seeing divestiture movements out of fossil fuels and other areas. And so the bottom line is we think that all around the wheel of this impact, as companies, the biggest companies in the world, are negotiating and dealing with their place in this new world where employees are demanding it, stakeholders are demanding it, your customers are demanding it. They're saying, who are you?
Right.
Employees are walking and saying, what do we stand for? What are we doing in the community? Where are we in these things? You're going to have to do the substantive hard work, and then you're going to have to report on it. And we think that there's a big place that we've kind of defined as impact as a service that we've been at for 13 years now, trying to build out this idea that there's a place for companies to enable that.
You mentioned at the top about your own sort of life cycle of learnings and how that led you to EVERFI, right? How the financial literacy, the idea behind that, same boat, credit card debt, whole deal after college. Think about it, how it impacts buying a house 15 years later. All of those things were things I never learned in high school or even in college. I had to learn on my own, much like you said. How now, as EVERFI has grown and you've made these major partnerships and you've worked with, I think, over 50,000 schools, if I remember from your website, how do you choose the new focuses? Like, how do you choose what is needed and what is impactful? What is that large scale social thing that may become the next piece of your curriculum, if I can use that word?
Sure. Yeah, it's such a great question. And we spend a lot of time thinking, studying, and working on this. Some of these things, because the data is so glaring. So financial education, healthcare literacy, you think about the lack of mental health resources for in particular for young people in schools, the struggle that parents have around digital management of devices, screen time, access, these things. A lot of this stuff is old and a lot of this stuff is actually fairly new. But that it's putting a lot of pressure on communities, on kids and employees as well. And so when we look at it, we really look at things and we say, number one, are there tons of answers for this? Like, can you go very easily and say, is there a definitive healthcare literacy course that teaches people about what Medicaid, how Medicaid works, what Medicare is with the, voucher programs, or food security initiatives work and everything else? The answer is no. Like, things like that don't exist. We built one of the very first African American history courses about 8 years ago now, a course called 306. And it was a very important course that brought racial equity, racial justice, and African American history to bear in schools. It was very clear that no one had gone through and really reimagined that in a way that brought excitement, energy, technology, social media, social gaming, those things to bear. So number one is anyone really doing it at a scale? Are teachers left to go harvest the parts of these things? Number three is there's this like missing layer where, one school has it, one school doesn't. There's no standardization, and it's all cobbled together. And there's no best practices or sharing or subject matter expertise to it. The fourth is what are the consequences of not having this education in schools? What does the data show you that happens when people don't have a proficiency level of learning or knowledge in and their financial wellness or their healthcare, journey in their life? Those are the things that we look at. So a lot of times people come to us and they say, hey, we should teach entrepreneurship, or we should teach civics or something. And our point is, we should. That's not, that's probably not us. We want to take on these infrastructure layers that we believe should exist underneath people, because most of these have a very significant cost to you, like a dollar cost, a pocket cost, that come if you don't do them well, or you don't have that knowledge set. We need to build that. Doesn't exist today.
With the depth and breadth of your offerings, you're K-12, you're in college, you're in the workplace, I'm assuming, and maybe a big assumption, but I'm assuming you see a lot of data here, a lot of trends, a lot of things that you're tracking. How helpful is it to you to have that eye line into all these different learning areas and be able to understand how projects are going and project out some things that are happening in the future, maybe future-proof some of your products a little bit, future-proof how the partnerships work? It would seem you have access to a lot here and a lot of diverse populations. How do you play with that as you're growing EVERFI?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. I mean, we learn the benefit of not being a one-trick pony, right, is extraordinary. And it would be easy to say get into financial literacy and just stay there. But I always say healthcare literacy is actually very much a financial issue. It's very different than health. This is not around obesity or taking care of yourself. This is about like navigation of the healthcare finance system, which is very much a financial literacy issue. So a lot of these things are first cousins of each other. So number one is there is kind of a logic to where we go next and offshoots that we learn. Number two is you do get the benefit of building one network. We built, I think there's still, if they're certainly one of them is two of the largest courses in the world. And so it gives you incredible insight and access as you look at what we did in our higher ed business. Over many years, we were able to, build out 1,000+ universities. We were able to layer course after course around diversity and inclusion, or around mental health, or around sexual assault prevention, or others. And so you get to layer in things that you learn from other courses, and it teaches you, like, sometimes, we will just fall flat on our face in terms of, we'll take something to the market and the market, doesn't like it. And it allows us to say, well, let's never do that again, or let's never, deploy that way before implement that way, or build something in, using too much video versus, maybe animation or something else. So you learn a ton by having millions and millions of users every year who are going through your stuff.
Transitions here to my next question of the work you do obviously is impactful. We've talked about that. What's the biggest challenge? Like, what's the thing? Is it wanting to move faster? Is it wanting to do more? What is the biggest challenge for EVERFI as we sit here today?
Yeah, so there's a speed and a pace that is happening right now in what I would call this impact as a service world. And it's not as much a bad challenge, it's just a challenge too. It's moving so fast. And I think the coming together of events that we've seen in the last couple of years of schools being shut down, remote learning,
Right.
the racial and social justice issues that have been brought to the fore, have been around for hundreds of years, but are now in front of us. And then the areas around the pandemic really brought so much movement, positive movement around dollars moving, companies trying to figure out their place in this, that we have to, in many ways, we have to pick our fights and our battles so that we can do, not try to boil the ocean and do, the things we decide to do really well. I think the second thing is there are still, you're dealing with district by district. One of the things that carries, I learned this when I was in the state legislature, education it could not be more hyper local in this country, and the decisions are made. I always joke, if you want to understand who has the power in terms of the smallest school district in Mississippi or the Department of Education in Washington D.C., the district in Mississippi is going to win that battle every minute of the day. These are decisions made locally. They're curriculum decisions made locally for the most part. And so if you want to scale this out, you have to go, district by district and really build long-term meaningful relationships. It's why I've always told our team, I think we're on like a 30, 40-year journey here. We're 13 years in, but it's a hyper-local thing, and that's challenging. We've actually built out an on-the-ground implementation team that's really unique. That's about 130 people. They're all of them are former full-time teachers, and they're actually on the ground in Memphis or Minneapolis or, Bakersfield, wherever it might be, implementing our courses, training teachers, doing the, professional development stuff.
There's been a lot of noise in the media around specific theories that may or may not be taught in different school districts. That's noise on a national level that it sounds like, from what you said, is less about what you deal with and more dealing with that district on the ground and what they're implementing. Is that right? Like that's sort of a national discussion that may not influence your work as much as what you are doing in these individual districts across the country?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because, this is the first time this last, maybe this last couple of years where where the Greek chorus around these things, just engulfs things so fast. And for the most part, what I tell people is you just got to have a lot of conviction in what you do. Education is I would say there's like almost nothing that the American, voter, the average American cares more about than what's going on in that building down on the corner of their street where their kids go, their grandkids go. That's a real plus. Like that's I love being in that environment. It also it becomes highly politicized. It used to be that it was just politicized by funding and equity. Now it's politicized over content. And that, again, you are not going to see a standard. So yeah, I think there's a lot of national noise. I don't pay much attention to it. We've gotten punched in the nose on national TV. It is what it is. It's my former politician in me. I don't even spend a second thinking about it.
Well, that's why I brought it up, because you've lived both worlds. And so I'm sure you have learnings and understandings of it. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds there, but I do want, with our final couple minutes here, you mentioned a 30 to 40 year plan. Right? That's the sort of the box you're in right now of planning and how you're trying to move forward. What's on the 3 to 5 year horizon for EVERFI? What's sort of the plan in the near term to keep churning out this great content, finding good partners, getting this in the hands of instructors and districts? Yeah,
we've developed just a huge amount of conviction that the areas that we're in matter a ton right now. And we've got a lot of room. I mean, just crazy amounts of room to run on this. So really the cornerstones for us are around financial wellness, healthcare literacy, mental health, and included in that like digital wellness and those areas, and then over to our workplace stuff and our workplace culture network, those areas. We have bitten off far more than we can handle right there. And the sustainability side is becoming really interesting. So that's become far more mainstream And I think everyone, no matter what side of the aisle or side of the learning spectrum you are on in terms of where your philosophy lies, you can't turn away from what's going on from a climate perspective in the country. And so I think like the fact that there's such a big missing learning layer around that, how does energy literacy work? Like these are core foundational infrastructure questions. They're not philosophical questions, and that needs to be built into the learning of what's going on in this country.
Tom Davidson, CEO and founder of EVERFI. You may have said you bit off more than I think you're chewing pretty well right now from what you guys are doing out in the world. Great
mouth
work.
Feels full.
Yeah. Understood. You'll get there, though. I appreciate the time here today. Again, Brandon wasn't able to be here. Dan Stratford filling in for him. Tom Davidson, CEO and founder of EVERFI. Where can people find more? This is the sort of thing I feel like people hear, they're going to go to their second grade teacher and say, hey, I heard about this program.
Sure.
What can someone do to get their district involved, get their classroom involved?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. If you go to everfi.com, EVERFI, it's all there, and it's easy to get in touch with us and check and see if your school is already on board. And if we're not, we need to be there. So appreciate it.
Tom Davidson, thanks so much for your time. And we'll be back next week with a brand new Bold Leaders in Learning. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.